Okay, I'm here today with Christine Uri. She's a former in-house counsel, and now she focuses on helping other in-house counsel address their ESG concerns. So I'm really happy to have a chance to chat with her today.
Well, thank you so much for having me on the show. It's just a pleasure to have an audience that really cares about ESG, and hopefully I can help a few people along to the next step.
So thanks very much. So first, could you tell me first tell me about your consultancy, just so we all know where it is. You're very famous on LinkedIn. You're always doing these LinkedIn lives. I'm always very jealous. But tell me a
Yeah.
little bit about the consultancy you're working on.
It's so kind. Yeah, my consultancy is called ESG for In-House, and I come out of a general counsel background where I worked through all kinds of ESG issues. So I launched this consultancy to help general counsel be successful in this area. I know more and more general counsel are taking on ESG. They may not have a lot of background in it, and so they need a little bit of help along the way. I do
Well,
just
and it kind of
general,
tracks your
yeah.
path. You tell us a
Yeah.
little bit about your path as an in-house counsel because you didn't always focus on ESG issues, right?
No, not at all. I am a lawyer by background. I spent 10 years just doing regular business practice in a law firm, M&A, financing contracts, all of those things that you'd normally do with absolutely no sustainability or ESG focus. And then I went in-house at a company that really worked with energy data from Fortune 500 and helped those companies reduce their energy usage, and that reduces their carbon footprint. And that was 2013, and then that company was acquired by NG, which is a multinational energy company headquartered out of France. And I basically grew up with the company. So I moved into the GC over the operations in the US. I took on the chief legal officer and at one point CHRO role. And at that point, it was called corporate social responsibility, but it came into my portfolio. And then we ended up expanding internationally to cover 20 different countries. And at that point, and my role became a dual hat between the chief legal officer and the chief sustainability officer. So over the course of all of those roles and all of that growth, I've hit about every ESG topic you can imagine. I've rolled out ethics plans, I've rolled out human rights plans, I've done carbon, water, waste, DEI, the whole spectrum. So that's why I really love working in this area now because I can bring, all of the expertise I built over a decade to help other companies succeed in the area.
Yeah. And perhaps, lucky for you, you're not working as a lawyer per se. You don't have your own law firm. You're giving more consultancy advice. And can you tell me about the difference and why you see value in doing it that way?
Yeah. Oh, you do. It has actually very hard as a lawyer to offer both consulting advice and legal advice. I looked into this for at the beginning and realized, oh, I have to have, if I do that, two separate entities and two separate sets of insurance, and I need to have different contracts for my clients. So I decided, I'm a business of one. I need to pick a road, and I decided to focus on consulting. And the reason is where I really like to contribute is at that strategic level. I do board and executive trainings. I help companies figure out what to focus on. I help them figure out reporting strategies, and I serve as a general sounding board. And those are often services that aren't necessarily legal in nature. I don't get into the nitty-gritty of how do you deal with litigation or how do I get this legal filing done? So I felt like the consulting approach better fit the value that I bring to my
Yeah, you're
clients.
more of a change manager in a way because you understand internally what in-house counsel needs organizationally from all the other stakeholders internally. So you know that how to help the board understand what their role is, what the different departments' role is.
Exactly.
Hmm. So, so what are the typical kind of companies that you work with? Like
Yeah.
who usually comes to your office? Are they companies that are subject to US laws or subject to overseas laws?
Yeah. I work with companies globally. I'd say I actually have more overseas clients than I do US clients. I think this is largely reflective of just the political atmosphere around ESG in the US, and also the fact that you can reach a global audience so easily today.
Hmm.
I do usually work with companies who are, maybe at the beginning of their journey, not necessarily, they don't have 100-person teams that are already all over all of these different aspects. They probably have under 5 billion in assets, and they might have one person, maybe two people who are working on sustainability full time, maybe no one. And just trying to get that initial setup, trying to set, what is the approach that the executive team needs to have, what are the key factors. And really, one of the most useful things I do for my clients is filter out what they should just not pursue, because it's one of it. The key thing in this area is you think about ESG, it's a very broad topic. Under the E, the S, and the G, environment, social, and governance, there are multiple subtopics, and a company can't do everything. I'm very well aware of that from my background
It's
working in a corporate
incredibly daunting
environment.
once you start looking into all of the
Yes.
different facets for each. I was
Yeah.
talking to some European lawyers the other day, and they were talking about the criteria under the CS Triple D or the CSRD, and they were like, "There's 1,500 different subtopics," and I just laughed. Like, that's
Yeah.
incredible.
Yeah, the CSRD really goes into extreme detail on all of these different topics. I've personally tried to stay out of doing any kind of CSRD reporting, but I do education around CSRD, particularly because I think it's really a lot of companies believe in the US at least that ESG or sustainability is just going to go away.
Hmm.
And I think this is largely comes from the SEC's decision to stay its own rule on climate disclosure.
Hmm.
The CSRD I look at is similar to the GDPR. It may be a global European regulation, but ultimately it's baked sustainability data and reporting into the system such that it's going to become an expectation of companies worldwide.
Yeah, because oftentimes you might be a U.S. company that's not necessarily subject to the CS. I'm getting CS triple D confused with CSRD,
Yes.
CRSD, whatever. It doesn't
Yeah.
matter. The point is, your customers might be subject to these reporting requirements. So you might have to give them data to sufficient for their reporting requirements, irrespective of whether or not you have an obligation to.
Exactly. And that's often a point at which companies will reach out to me for help. These kind of ESG questionnaires have been floating around for years. I was receiving them as a chief legal officer in 2016, but they were fewer and far between. And frankly, companies really didn't take the answers that seriously. Like whether they got the answers or whether they were good answers, they were just kind of in the atmosphere.
Yeah.
Today, when you have clients that are subject to reporting regulations that include their supply chain, those clients take getting that data and getting correct data really seriously. And
Well,
so
because their
yeah,
reporting requirements require sign off from executive sign off. So if the
yeah,
executive's going to sign off that our customers are telling us this, they want to make sure that it's accurate data.
exactly. And it's really important for US counsel to understand this, that there are these increased expectations and requirements on a large section of the customer base. And that includes European headquartered companies and then increasingly global companies because those European regulations have such a broad reporting framework. It'll touch 10,000 companies outside of Europe. The other piece that you really have to pay attention to in this space is uh, the net zero commitments. So
Mm.
over 4,000 companies have made net zero commitments. And if they've made a net zero commitment around scope three, that means that they need to get a handle on their suppliers' carbon data and be encouraging and helping their suppliers reduce their carbon footprint. So those even outside the CSRD, when you have companies who have made these commitments, they will again be looking to their supply chain, regardless of whether their supply chain has made similar commitments.
I thought you were thinking about net zero in terms of greenwashing risk, because there are a lot of
Mm.
kind of well-meaning companies whose sustainability departments suggest to the board you should make a net zero commitment, but they don't think through whether or not they actually have a plan to do that. And more plaintiffs are now pursuing actions against companies that have net zero pledges but no plan to implement the pledge. So
Yeah.
that's something
I
you need to
mean,
be thinking about as an in-house counsel.
absolutely. One of the first things I do if I get a new client is just go and look at whatever they've said publicly
Mhm.
before everything. Have they said anything about anything environmental? And it's interesting how many times I'll dig up something that the legal counsel isn't even aware of because for a long time, marketing would put out these statements. They wouldn't necessarily have a process for review. It wasn't, particularly risky. They might call a product green or say something was sustainable. Occasionally, a CEO will just, you know, for whatever reason, say in a press statement that the company's going to be net zero without
Yeah,
really
or they go on a
realizing
podcast or something like that. Yeah.
exactly. And they get pushed and they'll say, so you have to really, as legal counsel now, you have to be, first of all, setting up a process and making all of your stakeholders aware that any kind of environmental statement needs to have a legal review and making sure that you're building that DNA, but also going back and doing some digging in the past to see what's been said. Consistency is really critical, and then being able to have the data to back up your statements is absolutely essential.
Yeah, yeah. Being a litigator, I always think of it as like a chain of evidence where if you're going to make a statement, you have to have a footnote reference to some type of exhibit or piece of evidence that you have to support it. And usually it's a data point. It's actually a collection of data points. And that goes back to we do the same thing in the context of providing human rights advice. Because again, you can't boil the ocean. You have to target where your risk areas are, and part of identifying where your risk areas are to think through where you've actually already made statements and
Mhm.
made put obligations upon yourself. And similarly, you probably do that in the context of the broader ESG scope, where you say, A, what are your risks? What are your high risk areas? And B, where are statements that you've made?
Yeah, and I think you get to a very strategic choice when you've made statements that may not be accurate, about whether, okay, are you just pulling down the statement and crossing your fingers and hoping that nobody goes and digs it up, or are you going back and are you restating or clarifying? So you have to make some of those calls. I know with the new Canadian greenwashing regulation coming into effect, a lot of Canadian companies just pulled down statements because they just weren't sure. It's very broad. It's hard to predict what's going to qualify. So and for right now, a lot of Canadian companies are backing off of making those statements, which is I wish that they'd come up with something a little bit more clear because it could be dampening for the area. But then you also see companies that made an SBTI commitment a couple of years ago. It was very popular in 2021, 2022 to make these net zero commitments, and it still is. Companies are still making statements, but I feel like companies who are doing it today are a little more aware of what they're signing up for. When it first came out as a thing to do, companies just really didn't understand what they were signing up for. And then now in the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which is where you kind of register your net zero statement, you have 2 years to come up with a plan, and you have companies coming to the end of it without a plan, and they're needing to go back and kind of retrench what they said before and relook at it. Some are kind of losing their SBTI certification. So there's a lot of messiness. I do think that the majority of companies really are well intended and they kind of get caught up in just trying to figure out how to communicate what they're doing. Yeah, yes, there's some clear things that probably shouldn't have been said that are obvious, but there's also a lot of well-meaning companies just trying to work their way through this.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I say it in the human rights context, these people at these companies are not ghouls for the most part. Yeah, there are a
Yeah.
handful of sociopaths that just have
Yeah.
no ethical compass, but the majority of people are trying to do good. They're just stuck in a system where they have so many different priorities and they're just trying to manage
Yeah.
their
Well,
priorities.
and it's tough. I found this really interesting example from Virgin Atlantic. So Virgin Atlantic flew the first cross-Atlantic flight using 100% sustainable aviation fuel.
Okay.
And
What's this? Do you know what sustainable aviation fuel is?
I do know it. Actually, I do work with aviation clients.
Yeah, Bula Bula. I saw that.
Yeah, exactly.
My wife's
Exactly.
Australian, so I've used Fiji Airlines a few different times.
They're fantastic. They're a client and I love their flights
Hmm.
as well. But the sustainable aviation fuel, it is created from biosource. So it might be,
Like ethanol
farm.
based or
Exactly.
biomass fuel. Okay.
Exactly. And
Okay.
then you can actually, the great thing about sustainable aviation fuel is it's been vetted, so you can put it directly in the engines of existing planes today. You don't have to change the hard technology. And right now, airlines are blending it usually at a rate of 40% if they're using it. Those that are using it, it's more expensive and hard to get your hands on. But it has the potential to reduce the emissions from aviation up to 80% if enough of it can be created and distributed, which is there's a lot of hurdles to overcome to do that. But basically, sustainable aviation fuel is the best hope for decarbonizing aviation.
Okay.
Anyway,
Great.
getting back to Virgin Atlantic. So Virgin Atlantic flew this first flight over the Atlantic that was using 100% sustainable aviation fuel. That's unusual because, like I was saying, most companies will blend in 40%. And they talked about this flight and they said, "Oh, we flew this flight using 100% sustainable aviation fuel," which is the industry term. That is what it is called. And they were taken to task for that, looking at it from a consumer perspective, is saying, oh, consumers might not understand that that's really just 80% clean. That's not,
To be
100%
honest,
clean.
when you said that, and
Yeah.
it's to my discredit because I'm a lawyer, I should have been sharp enough. But when you said that, you said 100% sustainable aviation. I thought you meant 100%. Well, I thought you meant there was zero kind of combustion, zero carbon was created
Yeah.
because of that. And that's not what you said. You said that there was 100% of this fuel, which had the capability to reduce it up to 80%.
Yes. Which is, I mean, which gets into the detail because you think about from a Virgin Atlantic perspective, they're literally saying what they did using industry terminology, but that industry terminology isn't necessarily widely understood. So that's the kind of thing where I'm saying you have well-meaning companies that are trying their best to communicate, but then it just gets very difficult because the language isn't necessarily broadly known.
Well, and it also speaks to our job as lawyers and consultants to kind of to identify one press release is not going to ruin a company, but perhaps if they want to have a full marketing campaign to
Mhm.
release this new technology that they're going to be doing over 5 years that they really think are actually going to sway customers, then you really have to be buttoned up about what you're saying.
Yeah, yeah, and we've seen a lot of examples of that, and it gets into, particularly if you have products that you've labeled
Yeah,
green products, that kind of
exactly.
thing can be very. What is a green product? What does that mean?
Yeah. Or if they were
So
going to sell
yeah,
green tickets and that was going to be like a new type of product they sold, then you would want to, as lawyers, to really seriously consider exactly every word that's being said. Or
exactly.
similarly, on packaging labels, because particularly I mean, to be fair to the plaintiffs' lawyers, um, that is something that consumers look at. They look at the packaging. That does
Hmm.
sway their decision making.
Yeah.
Perhaps every customer doesn't hear every marketing snippet or something like that, but the packaging is pretty straightforward. So yeah, that was an interesting kind of tangent we went on.
Hmm.
I guess let's track back a little bit to
Yeah.
drag back a little bit to the companies that you're working with. So they're often either US companies that are working with for customers that have sustainability reporting obligations, or perhaps international companies as well. And that's similar with my practice. My first 10 years of my career, I was working on international arbitration. So I was working with clients from around the world, and my practice has kind of continued to evolve that way, even though I'm based in California. And now that's a good way to bridge to California. Have you started working with any companies that are preparing for their reporting obligations under SB 253 or 261? Or even if you're not working with clients, are you thinking about that for your own purposes?
Yeah, I'm definitely thinking about that. And clients in the US are largely aware of those if they're kind of approaching those kinds of revenue thresholds for the California thresholds, which are 500 billion for climate risk and 100 billion for climate measurement.
Hmm.
They're aware of them, and I'm
Did you say
definitely seeing
500 billion or 500 million?
500 million.
Yeah.
Sorry, I might have
I
said
was gonna say
billion.
500 billion in revenue.
Thank you for the correction.
Well,
But yeah, they're definitely aware, and I'm seeing companies that are starting, their carbon measurement process in anticipation of these California regulations. One thing I've been doing in all of my trainings is trying to create awareness of AB 1309, which is another California regulation that actually kicks in first, and it's related to those green statements, any kind of carbon target, any kind of environmental statement. And as of Jan 1, if you have something like that that's out there on your website, you're supposed to have something on your website that provides specific backup for how you arrived at that statement, why you think it's true, what progress you're making. And I feel like it's gotten so little press, and it doesn't have any revenue threshold. So it's literally all companies doing business in California, which is a very loose definition. So I've been encouraging legal counsel to really check this out. And I do think it's a great opportunity to go back and again look at those statements and see if they are appropriate and if your company should continue making them.
So maybe shifting gears a bit, I wonder if you have any thoughts as far as when you're in the process of change management for these companies and giving these advisory service, are there any particular recurring roadblocks that you find?
Mhm.
Or
I
perhaps
always
just pain points within companies?
Oh, there are many, but where I always start is with helping build the understanding across the leadership team and the board. Fundamentally, an ESG or sustainability program, it can't be run in any one silo. It can't just be run out of finance or just be legal, or if you have a chief sustainability officer, that person's team, should they even have a team, isn't going to be able to do it all. You have to have coordination from across the organization. And that means that you have to have the whole leadership team on board because they're going to have to be contributing time from their leaders, attention, making changes in how they operate. And so I always try to find that first step of creating that understanding. And I approach it from a couple different ways. One is just a stakeholder management. You need to look across your executive team and figure out, all right, who is going to be a supporter of moving forward with a sustainability or an ESG plan, who might have concerns, how can I sculpt what I'm doing to address, help the supporters and, address
Address the concerns.
concerns.
Yeah.
And so you kind of map that out. And then there's a piece of it that's kind of executive education based. I think it's important just to set the playing field. So I like to go in and do some basic education on, all right, what's happening in the market here? What are investors expecting? What are your clients expecting? I'll do some due diligence on what the client requests are. Where is that coming from? What are other companies doing? And I find, just starting with that financial piece is very helpful people have different thoughts on climate, on, the whole what company's role is. Everybody gets on board with financial things. So
Mhm.
let's start there. I like to talk about the regulatory context just specifically because it shows that longevity, how these kinds of expectations are now baked in, so companies do need to move forward. And then, touch on, all right, what does that really mean for you? Where do you as a company, what are the key areas that you need to be focused on and how do you drive it forward? So if you can get to the point where you have like a company-wide goal that is sponsored by the CEO to make progress against something, then you're really in a position to move forward.
Yeah. Yeah. And in the reverse, if you don't have that buy-in from the top, it's quite difficult
Yeah,
because each door you have to continually open. Whereas when you have CEO buy-in or board buy-in, the doors are already open because they've sent the memo.
exactly. Exactly. So my first goal is to try to open those doors.
Yeah. And do you have different types of specific training protocols? Do you have like day workshops or like week-long workshops or retreats
Yeah.
or
Yeah. I haven't done a retreat
you
yet,
haven't
but
done
I
a
would love
retreat to
to.
Fiji yet?
Yeah. Well, I have gone to Fiji.
Yeah.
So maybe I guess that's a retreat unto itself.
Yeah.
So
But yeah,
there
but
it
maybe you could
is.
market that as retreats to
Yeah,
Fiji for your company to
exactly.
learn
I could
about
have a little
ESG.
partnership,
Yeah.
right? Um, Yeah, it really it depends on what the appetite for the organization is. So I can do a day with an executive team where let's say we spend the first half of the day really getting into education. In that case, I'd go very deep on climate. I do find that climate is the biggest hurdle for companies right now. It's not that it's necessarily the most important piece of the frame, but usually companies have governance, in fairly good order, maybe, earmark AI governance is something they need to work on. They'll be stronger on the social aspects because they will have had some kind of, code of conduct and worker aspects. If you get into supply chain and human rights, like the work you do, that gets a lot stickier. But usually they've spent more time thinking about it.
The,
Climate
the problem
is,
with human rights and
yeah,
supply chains is those problems are difficult they're much
yes,
more intractable. Whereas so for instance, environmental issues, you can turn a few screws and reduce some emissions here, and you can do a lot of small things at the margins that A are profitable and B, feasible. With human rights, they're often very difficult problems once you discover them. So the first issue is putting together a plan that you can discover issues, and then the next issue is what you do about them, which
yeah.
is what I spend a lot of my time
Yeah,
working on.
I definitely agree. Human rights is very difficult to solve. I'm not sure I'd agree that climate is any easier to
Oh
solve.
yeah. No, I just mean certain things can be done, at the
Yeah,
margins. It seems. I feel like companies are happier to talk about climate issues than they are about human rights issues.
yeah, that's fair. I mean, if they have human rights issues in their supply chain, you're that will definitely create a ton of media focus and issues for the company. Yeah.
Yeah.
But
Well, no,
anyway,
well,
so
no. What I mean is talk about regulating there. So I feel like I feel like there's a bit more appetite at conferences, at differing areas for companies to lean into climate, whereas there's less of an appetite to lean into human rights issues. But
yeah,
that might be
definitely.
that might be me just seeing yellow Lamborghinis because I drive a yellow Lamborghini. I'm
Yeah.
just kidding. I don't drive a
No,
Lamborghini.
you're right in a sense, and that's what I was getting to. Is usually, yeah, if I'm doing a half day executive education, a lot of it will be focused on climate because that does tend to be the hot issue at the table that investors are asking for, clients are asking for, and companies just don't have the maturity on. And frankly, to avoid some of these greenwashing allegations, the leadership team needs to understand how you measure a footprint, what is a net zero target, and then wrap your head around what your climate risks are. A lot of leadership teams have not really thought through and digested the climate changes happening regardless. I mean, I hope you go net zero. I hope you're really working on that regardless of whether any one company goes net zero or if we all went net zero today. the climate change is happening. We're seeing that in the impacts in the huge, weather storms that we just had across Florida and North Carolina in the US. And so you have to get leadership to start thinking about some of those climate risks. So
So when
anyway,
you say climate risk, do you mean, for instance, if you have manufacturing facilities on the Gulf Coast, that's a climate risk, or do you mean your risk of contributing to climate change? So, for
when
instance,
I
your
say
manufacturing activities release carbon.
I mean the first. So
Yeah.
companies need to be looking at how the change in weather patterns, how increasing heat, how rising sea levels could impact their operations and their
Hmm.
employees.
Hmm.
And it's a difficult thing to do because you really have to project out. You have to first accept that something has changed, and then you have to project out and say, okay, what is this going to look like in 2030 or 2040, and how is that going to impact my business? I don't do a full climate risk assessment, but I will bring up with executive teams that this is a thing that they need to pay attention to and a base analysis to get them to understand what the climate risks for their business could be. Anyway, so I'll do a half day on that and then a half day on setting strategy. Or sometimes, I'm just brought in to do an hour for the ESG team or whatnot. So I customize to what the organization needs and what their level of maturity is.
I like that idea, though. You spend the first half of the day talking about the problem, and then the second half of the day talking about how to solve it. I used to say that when I was a younger associate, that it's important to not just go to your boss with a problem, but to go to them with a problem and a solution. You know.
Yes.
Um,
Yep.
I think I didn't re learn that until I actually had associates coming to me, though, with
Yeah.
problems.
I learned that when I went in-house. So I came from a law firm associate environment, and usually my job in that context was finding problems. And then I remember the first time I walked into the GC's office with a problem, and he was like, well, what would you do about that? And I hadn't thought about it, but on the fly,
Yeah,
I was like, well, this seems like what would make sense. And he's like, great, do that.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
and it seemed very on the fly, but what I came to learn is that he was intentionally teaching me judgment
yeah.
and making me, think through things and then giving me the power to just give it a try and see what happened.
For me, when I began managing people, it was less about, to be honest, it was less about teaching them, but more just wanting to impart on them that, like, try not to make my workload more difficult. Try to, um, but that's for another day. So this has been really, really interesting. It's a fascinating uh lane that you've taken on the change management role and the education role, and I can see how your position as an in-house counsel really helps that because it allows you to speak from a legal background, but also from kind of a corporate background.
Mhm. Yeah.
Which is, to be frank, is something that, for instance, I don't have. I've never worked in a corporation before, so I'm less knowledgeable about the intricacies of how different departments run and things like that.
Yeah, and that's really the knowledge shed I bring to bear. There's a lot of people who do an amazing job with ESG consulting and sustainability consulting, but I do think that you have a different perspective if you've sat in that seat and tried to figure out, okay, how do I chessboard, whatever change I'm trying to make through the organization.
Well, and like you said, you don't want to get in the weeds of the carbon data that's coming in and compiling that data so that you can report it. There's plenty of consultancies that have staff that can do that type of kind of rigorous work, but you want to do higher level strategic analysis, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So this has been really, really great. I wonder what I like to do towards the end of these conversations is talk about where you see the horizon, where you see the growth in these areas. So I wonder if you could have any thoughts about where you see the next few years in the ESG space.
Yeah, I am thinking that in the next 2 to 3 years, right now companies are really stuck, with on climate and on reporting and trying to digest, particularly EU companies digest some of these reporting requirements, and everybody's trying to get forward their data. Yeah, I have rolled out a ton of compliance and reporting programs across different areas. And one thing I learned is the first year is the hardest. The first time that you do it is the hardest. And so I, the the thing that's unfortunate about this reporting phase is the folks who are doing the reporting are the same folks that would be actually making improvements,
Hmm.
and they only have so much bandwidth. So I'm seeing, more time spent on reporting and less time spent on taking action. I'm hoping that we kind of everybody gets through this first round and then things even out a bit and it gets the reporting burden gets a little easier because you've got your feet under you.
Well, and
And
there's the problem, the multiplicity of different reporting schemes and structures too that I hear from sustainability officers they have a real
yeah.
problem with.
And there's been a lot of work done on convergence around those. It's not a perfect system at all, but it that has been a frustration. There is a lot of convergence work. But I'm, optimistically hoping that the reporting burdens get easier and that companies wrap their head around climate. I do think that the next issue that's coming up is nature and biodiversity. Nature and biodiversity is absolutely a very large threat at the I've seen it listed as a top five risk globally, but it's something that they're starting to develop standards for. The TNFD is working on, how do you think about nature and diversity or nature and biodiversity as a company. There's 300 companies that have signed on to analyzing and reporting on that. I think companies are going to hear more about that in the coming years. But
Would you
right
put the
now,
EU's deforestation legislation kind of in that bucket rather than, well, I guess it is kind of a climate bucket as well to the extent that
yeah.
forests are
The, There's
filters
a
for carbon.
large overlap between climate and biodiversity because certainly, climate is impacting biodiversity and nature, but there can be ways in which, climate actions might not be the best for nature and biodiversity. It's a very,
Oh,
kind of
really?
tangled
Can we
area.
expand on that thread just a little bit? That sounds interesting. In what
Yeah.
sense? Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, it can be when you're trying to, if you are trying to find nature-based solutions, you have to look very carefully to see how those solutions may impact the environment around them. Same with if you're deploying massive renewables, how do those impact the environment around them and the species that are in the area? So
Yeah, if you're
it
clearing land to grow feed crop for sustainable jets, so then you
yeah.
just grow corn for miles and miles and miles, that might affect biodiversity.
Yeah, yeah. And the solutions are a bit different as well. So I think nature and biodiversity is going to be a big issue, but it'll probably take 2 or 3 years to get there, just because there's so much happening for people to wrap their heads around with the reporting and climate right now.
Hmm. Well, thanks so much. You must be very busy, so it just underscores that we appreciate you coming on today and taking the time to chat with us. So thanks very much,
My pleasure.
and
I appreciate
we
you
look
having me.
forward to hearing more from you in the future.
Mhm.